What if the future you imagine is actually based on your memories? Annie Duke chats with neuroscientist and host of the Inner Cosmos podcast, Dr. David Eagleman, about how the surprising ways our brains process and interpret information influence the decisions that we make. They tackle sensory hacks, decision quirks, and why lashing yourself to the mast could be your best bet against temptation.
I realized that the right way to think about the brain is as a machine that's built on conflict. You've got this team of rivals in Abraham Lincoln's terminology. You've got all these different neural networks that have different desires, different wants. And the way to think about what's happening in the brain is it's like a neural parliament where you've got all these political parties, all of whom want the right thing for their country, but they all have very different desires in terms of what they think that is. So what that means is that the way the brain makes decisions is nothing like a computer. And you, with the exact same brain, will make very different decisions at different moments, depending on what the temptations are that surround you, what the circumstance, the social context, all of that.
In this episode, you will discover the way simulating the future helps us combat temporal discounting and make better decisions, the power of Ulysses contracts, and the social dynamics of decision-making. This is the Decision Education Podcast, where we explore the science of decision-making with a diverse range of experts and offer practical strategies to transform our understanding of the role decisions play in our lives. This season of the podcast is brought to you by First Round Capital.
I'm so excited to welcome my guest today, David Eagleman. David Eagleman is a neuroscientist, best-selling author, an entrepreneur who has made it his life's work to unravel the mysteries of the human brain. As a professor at Stanford University, he leads groundbreaking research into time perception, sensory substitution, and the intersection of neuroscience with law and technology. David's insatiable curiosity has led him to write several acclaimed books, including Live Wired and Incognito, which explore the brain's adaptability and hidden workings. He's also the creator and host of the Emmy-nominated PBS series, The Brain, and the podcast, Inner Cosmos. David is a graduate of Rice University, where he earned a BA in British and American Literature, and the Baylor College of Medicine, where he earned a PhD in neuroscience. Beyond academia, David serves on the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Neuroscience and Behavior and has founded several neurotech companies. His ability to translate complex scientific concepts into engaging narratives has made him a sought-after speaker and science communicator, inspiring millions to think differently about their brains and decision-making processes. David, I am so excited to have you on this podcast. I can't even. We met actually just a few months ago. My husband had stalked you, I think, who's also the co-founder of the Alliance for Decision Education, and you have been incredibly kind in supporting the cause, putting together two great events out in California, in your area, and just so appreciative of the support that you give the organization. So let me just start off there with a huge thank you.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure, Annie.
So I want to understand from the horse's mouth about what you do and what your path was to getting here. So I think I would be remiss in pointing out that you started off as an English major.
That's true.
Which seems like a very odd path to neuroscience. So, I would love to hear you kind of talk about, what was your path to getting where you are now and why and how did this happen?
Well, I always grew up with two loves, literature and science. And in college, I was studying a lot of science. I was studying electrical engineering and space physics and so on, but I couldn't quite find the thing that I loved in science. And it wasn't until my last semester of my senior year that I took a neuroscience class, and then I was hooked. I was in at that point on. But yeah, so that's why my major was literature, which was really my first love. And I've always, I write fiction as well as nonfiction. I have 8 books, and I'm about to finish my 9th and 10th. So that's a big part of my life still. I think it's because literature and science are trying to do the same thing. They're just different ways of trying to get at the truth. They have slightly different ways of verifying knowledge and, going out and running experiments in the science world. But otherwise, they're both trying to figure out what the heck we're doing here.
That's true. Actually, I hadn't really thought about it through that frame, but that's a great frame. So having taken that neuroscience class in your senior year and discovering that this was your love, obviously you go on to become a neuroscientist. When we think about a neuroscientist, you're traditional in some ways, obviously, but in many ways you're not, because you have a sort of a very big and broad way of interacting with that discipline. Can you just talk a little bit about what you do, how you interact with neuroscience, how you interact with the public?
Yeah, my interest in neuroscience has always been the big picture of how do you take all these pieces and parts, these 86 billion neurons and all the activity and chemicals and so on, and get something out of it, like, your life and your technicolor perception of the world and so on. So everything that I do somehow falls under that question of how does the brain construct reality? And there are many different channels within that I take. So, for example, one thing that I do is called sensory substitution, which is, can we push information into the brain via unusual channels? I also study ways that people see reality differently. For example, in synesthesia, about 3% of the population has a mixture of the senses. So when they, let's say, look at letters of the alphabet, that triggers a color experience for them. It's not a disease or a disorder. It's just an alternative perceptual reality. But we study lots of these things, like how people have very different memories, how some people have a loud internal voice and some people have no internal voice, how some people have very clear visual imagery like a movie and other people have none at all. So I'm very interested in those sorts of topics too. Also, I'm interested in how this cashes out for society. So I run a national nonprofit called the Center for Science and Law, which is about where neuroscience intersects with the legal system. So these are all the kinds of things that I'm very interested in. And then I guess the other part of your question is, many years ago, I started writing books. I grew up watching Carl Sagan on television, and it was, I was so inspired by him. And my parents said something to me at some point, like, "Oh, you're going to be, president of the United States someday." And I said, no, I want to be Carl Sagan someday. So that's that's what I enjoy doing, is public communication of science as well.
Can you talk about one of the frameworks that you sort of developed for one of your books, maybe the one that you're kind of the most proud of?
Yeah. A couple examples. When I was writing my book Incognito about what's going on under the hood, in the unconscious brain, I realized that the right way to think about the brain is as, a machine that's built on conflict. You've got this, what I ended up talking about is a team of rivals in Abraham Lincoln's terminology. So you've got all these different neural networks that have what they have different desires, different wants. And the way to think about what's happening in the brain is it's like a neural parliament where you've got all these political parties, all of whom love their country and want the right thing for their country, but they all have very different desires in terms of what they think that is, whether to eat the cookies or not eat the cookies, or go to the gym, or make a promise to somebody that you'll go to the gym. They've all got different ways of going about things. Some short-term, some long-term. These are all areas of interest in decision-making that perhaps we'll get to momentarily. Anyway, so what that means is that the way the brain makes decisions is nothing like a computer. And you, with the exact same brain, will make very different decisions at different moments, depending on what the temptations are that surround you, what the circumstance, the social context, all of that.
I want to go back to the team of rivals, because I think this is something so core to decision-making. We can think about, when we're making decisions, we have lots and lots of different competing goals, that we're trying to satisfy in some way. And you mentioned one of them, which is, I'm trying to make myself happy now, and I'm trying to make some future version of myself happy also. And those two things are in competition. Should I eat the cookie now, as you said? Because me now thinks the cookie would be very yummy. But obviously future me would prefer that I don't eat that. Right. I mean, and this is actually a huge tension. And we know that in decision making, something called temporal discounting, which is we tend to overweight the present and discount the future, which is why we eat lots of cookies and chips and things like that, despite our long-term goals. But it sounds like what you're talking about with a team of rivals is really kind of, this is the neurological basis for that type of tension as we're trying to balance out those different goals. I think this idea of how are we thinking about balancing the different, in some ways, the different versions of ourselves that have different goals, like balancing different time horizons, things like that. I want to kind of bring this team of rivals thing back to, Kahneman and Tversky, particularly Kahneman, as he wrote about in Thinking Fast and Slow, and this idea of system one and system two. Very popular, right? An extremely popular concept. Lots of people will throw it out.
Very popular, a little oversimplified, but yeah.
I prefer the term deliberative and reflexive systems, but system one and system two would generally map onto that. System one being reflexive, system two being deliberative. I think that, and I have a neuroscientist here that I get to talk to, so excited to say this, because I think that most people assume that maps onto the brain pretty cleanly. And the way that they generally talk about it is that system 2 is situated in the prefrontal cortex. I'm guilty of this myself. And system 1 would be in the temporal lobe. Can you talk a little bit about, first of all, how do you think about system 1, system 2? How does it relate to this gang of rivals? And then sort of, is there a neurological mapping to that at all? Or is that just a silly way that we oversimplify that concept?
Okay, so I'll take those in reverse order. So the general story with everything in the brain is that it's generally impossible to pin down a spot in the brain or an area. It would be like if I gave you a map of your city and I said, okay, Annie, just put a pin where the economy is. And you'd say, but it's all the interaction of all the pieces and parts going on here. And I say, yeah, but tell me where it is. So it's the same idea with pretty much everything in the brain. That said, the reason I don't love the system 1, system 2 thing, although Kahneman was awesome and Tversky was awesome and I love their stuff generally, but it's because it's more complicated than that. That actually hides a lot of the complexities. It's much more interesting than just, you've got the automatic and then the conscious part. So that's what I think about that is, it's a good start, but it doesn't actually expose all of the stuff going on. And there's one more thing. This is, I think you and I might have talked about this once, but just for interest, I want to maybe play devil's advocate against ourselves on one point here, which is the idea that we can put probabilities on anything in life. There's mathematically, we can do this for all kinds of good things and which card will come up next and so on. But when it comes to what I should do in terms of, the cookie or the job or the whatever, it's very difficult to put probabilities on this or determine expected values on these things. And this is this concept, I think we talked about, it's called Knightian uncertainty, introduced by an economist named Knight, who said, there are lots of questions for which you just can't put a p-value on it. So just as an example, what's the probability that there's life in the cosmos besides humans? Who the heck knows? Like, it's really hard to put a p-value on it and say, I got it. It's 0.375%. So that's the thing that I think we deal with a lot in life is when we're making decisions about things, it's not like we know exactly how to assign those p-values.
Yeah. So I would push back. I'm going to push back on that for a second.
Right.
And what I'm going to say is, yes, there's Knightian uncertainty. I think that for anything that we're deciding that has consequence to our life, what I would argue is that somewhere under the hood, we're making some guess at what the probability of certain things occurring is. And the only reason that I say that is because it kind of has to be so, in my opinion. If I'm trying to decide, not having Waze or a mapping system, what route I'm going to take to work and when I should leave, all of that's probably happening pretty quickly. But really what it has to do with is if I think about the chances I'm going to get there in under 30 minutes or 30 minutes to 45 minutes or 45 minutes to an hour, which then has to do like, what's the probability there's really bad traffic at this time of day, sort of bringing my experience into this, right? And then I have the other thing of like, how bad is it if I'm late? So the way that I actually manage my risk there, for example, is going to be different if I'm trying to catch an international flight than if, I'm just trying to get to the grocery store or something like that, right? Because I can tolerate getting it wrong, quote unquote, like having a bad outcome. So we may not explicitly be saying, here's the probability of different things. And there's certainly no right answer in the sense that we can't know for sure. Like we're not omniscient. And so we can't objectively know that the answer is that 67% of the time I'm going to encounter traffic that's going to cause me to have a 15-minute delay, right? So that would be very difficult to do, but we are obviously forecasting that because that's how we decide when to set our alarm. It's how we decide to leave our house. It's in fact how we decide who we're going to marry. We think about those goals that you're talking about, right? And we're trying to figure out, does this person in comparison to other people have a higher probability of actually getting me the things that I believe that I want? Although I might be wrong about what I want. That's okay. Compared to other people that I believe that I might meet in the future or people who I have already met that I could go and try to get to marry me.
Well, yeah, multiplied by the probability that you'll get somebody else. You get one of those other people, yeah.
Right, of course, right? So in that sense, like these calculations have to be occurring under the hood. my point about sort of trying to forecast these probabilities is you might as well make that explicit. Because if you make it explicit, then other people can look and say, I think you're probably pretty far off on that. Let's have a discussion about it. And you're actually going to sort of, maybe in terms of this team of rivals, you're going to be better at understanding like how much you value different pieces of the equation. You can actually check your accuracy. There's all sorts of good things that come out of that, but I certainly would never think that when you're forecasting some probability that you can know for sure. Like these are educated guesses. They're going to have pretty wide bands. I just think they're happening anyway. So you ought to try to make them explicit.
Fair enough. What do you think about when we have pretty bad illusions about the probabilities of something and that ends up being useful? Just as an example, when I wrote my first book, Some, I thought, this will be straightforward. Everyone's going to love this book. And I submitted. I got rejection after rejection after rejection. But it didn't slow me down at all. I just kept submitting. I kept going like a maniac. I got a stack of rejection letters as high as the book. And it finally got published after like 200 rejections. And then it did well. But I'm so glad that I went in completely naive because I feel like it could have been a very different thing had I gotten 10 rejections and said, okay, I give up. The P is very low here.
This is one of those problems of survivorship bias. So, the question that you want to ask is, so we have David Eagleman, who has a pile of 200 rejections, finally got his book published. It was actually a success. And then he got to publish all sorts of other books and end up doing a TV show, end up, doing a podcast. And are we supposed to actually make decisions based on David Eagleman's experience? Or are we supposed to look at what's very hard to find because we don't know about them? The hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of David Eaglemans who got the 201st rejection or the 202nd rejection and actually never ended up getting their book published. And there was a huge opportunity cost to that because they weren't focusing on other things that would have made themselves more successful, or they did actually end up getting it published after 200 rejections and 3 people read it. And it didn't actually help them and they didn't get tenure. And again, they spent so much time on that when they could have been doing it on other things that would have made them more successful. And I think that's a really hard thing, right? So that stick-to-itiveness that you showed, clearly anybody who's successful has been gritty. That is absolutely true. But it doesn't mean that we're supposed to advise people that being irrationally gritty would be good, right? And it's that question of where is it irrational versus not? And it depends a little bit on what your goals are, right? What the risk is that you're willing to take, how much positive expected value you need in order to continue, how much you care if you fail, what your other alternatives are, and all those things. It gets very complicated. But I think survivorship bias is just a really, really powerful bias that can lead us to cling to these stories and then get sort of turned on its head and into a rationalization for continuing things that you ought not continue anymore. But sometimes it's good because being gritty, you can't succeed if you're not gritty.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a tension between the two.
Yeah. I totally take that point about survivorship bias. I do wonder, though, what you had said about sitting down with a friend. And if I said, look, here's my probability that I'll get this book published. And if somebody sat with me, they'd say, look, Eagleman, you're wrong. The p-value is very tiny. So you should give up now. I just think it's hard.
But you need a really good friend because a really good friend will say, what are your values?
Yeah, that's right.
Do you care if you want to just keep trying? Do you care? What are you sacrificing? What would you be doing with the time? You have to actually walk them through that. And what you have to do is find a friend who's not going to impose their own values on your decision.
We need probability advisors, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I want to go back to this idea of mental time travel. And I want to understand sort of from a neurological standpoint, like how would you say like that ability that humans have to be able to imagine beyond their lifetimes, like, I know that you obviously can't go back in evolution, but first of all, do you believe that that's unique to humans? When you look at other species, how far ahead in time do you think they can get? And then I guess what I would add to that is sort of what's the purpose of that, right? Is that helpful to decision making, for example, this ability that we have to be able to do that? And how can we then harness that maybe to help make our decisions better?
Yeah. So this is one thing that human brains do. They do it way better than anyone. It's actually very difficult to answer the question of how much can other animals do it. There's not a lot of evidence that they do it. For example, squirrels will bury their acorns for the winter, but it's not clear if they're doing that just as a reflexive thing rather than thinking about the threat of the winter coming. But humans, we actually spend most of our time not in the here and now, but in the there and then, either thinking about our past or simulating possible futures. And we're extraordinarily good at it. Now, that said, the caveat here is that, we often misremember. Our memories are actually quite poor in many ways. And whenever we're remembering an event that's already happened, that gets polluted with new data that we've had since then. And we simulate possible futures, but of course that is limited by our experience. And if we haven't seen, this is in a sense close to the availability bias, if we've never seen some kind of situation, then we imagine the situation that we are able to, and we take that to be more probable. But that said, that's what allows us to make good decisions or better decisions than we would otherwise, because we can simulate things out, simulate all the players. We have extraordinarily social brains. Well, if I say this, then he'll say that, and then blah, blah, blah. And you're able to say, hey, that might actually work. And so we do things that way. We spend most of our time in those futures.
So if I understand what you just said, when we're imagining the future, what we could say is that we're actually remembering. Is that fair?
That's exactly right.
So when we imagine the future, we're actually remembering, and we're taking past experiences and recombining them in a novel way. Is that kind of like
That's exactly right. And actually, I would say that's sort of a new framework in neuroscience, but it actually goes back to Galen, the Greek physician, who said essentially this, that the reason that we remember is so that we can generate possible futures. So yes, but the modern scientific evidence for that has to do with people who get damage to part of the brain called the hippocampus, and they can't remember, and therefore they're unable to simulate the future. So you say to them, hey, think about the vacation that you want to take next month. Let's say you go to the beach. What's that going to be like? And they say, I can't picture anything. I don't see it. I'm just blanking here. They're unable to simulate possibilities. So clearly the systems in your brain involved in memory are the same systems involved in simulating possible futures. But of course, we're creative. It's not simply a reproduction of the past. It's a remix of it. And we're bending and breaking and blending ideas to generate these new possible stories.
So when you put people in an fMRI machine and you ask them to imagine the future, it's the same. It's the hippocampus that's being, the same areas that are associated with memory are being recruited.
Yeah, exactly. It's a whole network of areas, but it's greatly overlapping. You see the same general networks. Yep.
Let's recap what we've heard so far. Annie Duke and David Eagleman discuss Eagleman's work as a neuroscientist and explore how the brain processes memory and simulates possible futures. Eagleman explains how the brain constructs reality through various channels, such as sensory substitution and synesthesia, and how we can calculate probabilities based on our individual views of reality. His team of rivals framework highlights the brain's internal conflicts in decision-making, comparing neural networks to a neural parliament with competing desires. The Decision Education Podcast is supported by First Round Capital. In a world of constant change, making effective decisions is more crucial than ever. First Round Capital understands this. They're not just investing in startups. They're investing in decision makers who shape our future. From AI to clean energy, First Round Capital backs founders who ask the right questions and make choices that promote a brighter future. Learn more at firstround.com and see how better decisions lead to better outcomes.
So there was recently an interesting study that I saw. I wonder if you saw it, and hopefully I won't butcher it, which was about theory of mind. So, theory of mind is the ability for me to imagine how you might be viewing or how you might be feeling about a situation that I'm viewing as well. In developmental psychology, very classic study would be you have some sort of 360, scene where there's like a mountain in between, so that me, the viewer, looking at one view of that, can't actually see in that moment what somebody from the other side is seeing. You have a child walk around it, and the question is, when they're looking from one direction and you put a doll over on the other direction and you say, what can the doll see right now? What is the age at which they can actually tell you what the doll would be looking at or another child would be looking at? So really being able to get into somebody else's head. So this is another one of these problems, right? Which is when you're looking at animal models, do they have theory of mind? Hard to say. So there was an ingenious study with crows who, as you know, are very smart. And they had food that they could hide and they had places that they could hide it. And the room that they were in when they were hiding it had a peephole. And so they wanted to know if the crows would act differently in terms of hiding the food, if the peephole were open or closed. And then they also had the crows experience looking through the peephole so that they could see into the room. And it turned out that if the crows had experience looking through the peephole, that they actually acted very differently when the peephole was open versus when it was closed, depending, in terms of how they were hiding their food. So it seemed to be pretty strong, at least in my view. I don't know, you could pick it apart, I'm sure. Pretty strong evidence that crows may actually have theory of mind.
Cool.
There's different ways that we can take perspective, right? So one of the things that I need to do in order to be a really good decision maker is to be able to take the perspective of my future self, right? And understand how my future self might feel or experience, the outcomes of decisions that I'm making today. But obviously, there's also, how are other people going to view me? How are other people going to view the decision? Can I put myself in somebody else's shoes and understand their perception of what I'm doing? So can you kind of talk generally about theory of mind? Is it unique to humans? Why is it so important for decision making? And also magic, by the way. Why is it so important for magic?
Yeah. So as far as we know, theory of mind is mostly a human thing, although this study you said about crows might prove otherwise. It might be that some other really smart animals develop it possibly independently. Corvid brains have a, pretty different evolutionary history than we do, but they might have ended up at the same place. But yeah, this ability to simulate what it's like to be someone else is something that we use every day. Obviously, magicians use it in the sense that they really need to know what the audience member is thinking and where their spotlight of attention is, and therefore what things they have seen or not seen the magician do. The magician totally depends on this, but so do con artists, so do psychiatrists, so do novelists. Everybody needs to know, okay, what is the other person thinking? So do poker players, by the way. They, can do this at many levels. Like, what is she thinking that I'm thinking that she's thinking? So we're quite good at doing this. It's a developmental skill that children don't start off with and eventually develop. And my interest lately has been in whether AI has theory of mind, because several people have written little papers saying they think AI has spontaneously emerged, or I should say theory of mind has spontaneously emerged within these large language models. I totally disagree. So this has actually led to something that I've recently defined called the intelligence echo illusion, which is that, what these large language models are trained on is everything written by all the humans over all this time. And so often what happens is you type in a prompt, it gives you an answer that exists 100 places. People have written about this, but you don't know that possibly. And so you say, oh my God, this thing, it's sentient, it's got theory of mind, whatever. But in fact, it's just an echo of the intelligence that's already there among the humans. And to you, you mistake it for a voice. But anyway, all this is to say, I don't think AI can, or at least large language models, the way they're structured now, they are statistical parrots that are, knowing very deep things about the probability of which word comes next, but they don't know what it is to be inside somebody else's head.
So when a large language model, there's that famous story of the person from Google who was very upset, right? Yeah. Because they felt that their LLM was sentient. But yeah. When we see something, we don't like to just say it can be explained just sort of statistically, right? Like, this is just somebody said it and it was in the training set and that's what it just parroted it back at you. And no, it doesn't have any consciousness and it doesn't know what it's saying, just in the same way that, we didn't develop the traits we have for a purpose. They got selected for it because of random variation in the population, right? And it feels like that all kind of goes back to the way that human beings really try to impute meaning. And maybe we can talk about that even more broadly, because it's not just meaning, right? But our brains really like to create patterns. So maybe you could just speak to, what are the benefits of that pattern recognition that our brains are so good at? Like, why is that happening? But then also kind of where does it go wrong? Not just in terms of like, my LLM actually loves me, right? Which might happen. But also when the pattern recognition kind of goes awry and we end up in conspiracy theory thinking.
Yeah. The general story is the world is far too complex for us to be able to take that in. And so we're always imposing our patterns. There's a lot of ways of talking about this. I always talk about this in terms of the internal model, and we're looking for things that match our model. Other people talk about it as screens that we're looking through, and we only see what we're able to see through the screen, and so on. But yes, this is what we're trying to do, is make patterns that allow us to interpret what the heck is going on out there. And often this leads us to mistaken conclusions. I mean, this happens in 1,000 ways. Neuroscientists study, for example, pareidolia is where you see faces everywhere. So like, your little electrical plug, it looks like a little face, or you see burn marks on a piece of toast, it looks like a little face, or you see a cloud and you think it's a face, or the man on the moon, stuff like that. What that illustrates, of course, is simply that we are really pre-programmed to find faces. That's massively important to us. And so therefore we oversee that. And this happens all the time when you look at stock market investors and the patterns that they impose when they're looking at random fluctuations of a stock going up and down. People run studies on this, and they have all kinds of patterns that they'll impose on this. So, yep, it's something that we do, and often it leads us astray. Although often it's something that, that's important.
Well, obviously developmentally to humans, finding faces is really important. But when we start to overly pattern match, obviously it's going to really affect our decisions, right? I mean, and in the extreme case, when you start to believe in conspiracy theories, the kind of decisions that you then make are obviously highly compromised because we're matching everything to a particular scheme or a model that we have about the way that the world works, which isn't actually representative of the world, right?
Yeah, exactly right. By the way, if anyone's interested, I did a special episode of Inner Cosmos on conspiracy theories and why brains, at the extreme will go for those. And it has to do with, it's, as you're saying, it's doing the right thing, which is saying, hey, is this connected to this? Maybe that's connected to that, and so on. But I think there are lots of reasons why people go for conspiracy theories. And there's a whole social aspect, I think, that gets overlooked when we talk about this sometimes, which is just that, if you've got some conspiracy theory, you get to be the one at the party who says, oh, I think blah, 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 and you get attention for it. And maybe people think you're really smart for detecting that, or you think that people think you're smart for detecting that, or whatever, or you just like being the contrarian or whatever it is. But there are all kinds of reasons why people will generate or repeat conspiracy theories.
And I assume some of them have to do with, if you go back to the Gang of Rivals, that the other way that you can derive social capital from that is that there's other people who believe the conspiracy theory, and now you have group belongingness as well, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, people will bond over the strangest things. And so, yeah, exactly right. If I believe in a flat earth and you do too, then we can be pals and link arm and talk about how terrible everyone else is that they don't believe in that.
I think the general view is that conspiracy theories are for the less intelligent among us, and that more intelligent people obviously don't fall for conspiracy theories. True? Not true.
Here's what I think it all comes down to, and this is, you would love this, this is your language, it just comes down to probability. So, for example, the idea that we faked the moon landing. So you might say, hey, that seems plausible, but you have to think through the probability. Okay, let's see, how many people at NASA would have had to be involved in that? Okay, how many journalists, how many cameramen, how many blah, blah, blah. Okay, a lot of people. What are the probabilities that not a single person there is going to defect over the course of 70 years? And then, of course, what's the benefit for them defecting? Well, if you're the one who defects and you get to write the New York Times bestselling book on how you did the whole moon fake thing, that's pretty good incentive to defect. Maybe even if there's such military rigor that nobody's going to defect, what are the chances that like the grandson doesn't find something in the attic of the guy who did something? Anyway, you start putting together the probabilities, and that's, I think, the way that maybe a good thinking brain makes decisions about these. It's not to say that there can't be conspiracy theories or there can't be things improbable that happen. It's just that some stories are more plausible than others. And I think we just have to look at the probabilities on these things.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think the evidence actually pretty strongly shows that smart people fall for conspiracy theories all the time as well. That it's not like a smart, dumb thing at all. It's the way our brains work. And people are more or less independent of intelligence prone to overmatching, basically.
That's right. And Ted Kaczynski, for example, is a very high IQ guy, the Unabomber, and also had lots of these things. Yeah, exactly right. There's all sorts of aspects of why you might believe it. And then, by the way, this is something that comes up in psychoses where people have, for example, schizophrenia, where they will they will link things that aren't linked, that aren't related. They will think these things have a meaningful relationship between them. And so it's very easy for somebody with schizophrenia, for example, to generate conspiracy theories. The interesting part is those conspiracy theories that actually catch on, which is to say that somebody with schizophrenia will link lots of things, but most other people won't say, oh, that sounds right to me.
In my world, when I think about cognitive biases and how they affect decisions, I think there is this interaction between the way we perceive time and cognitive biases. So I don't know if you have an example of how our perception of time might lead to cognitive bias, or any, personal experience where understanding that kind of helped you make a decision.
Oh, that's interesting. The relationship between them. I mean, here's what I would say. What all my research showed was that the amount of time we think something took has to do with the density of memory we have. So if we lay down a lot of memory about something, it seems to have taken longer because retrospectively we're making that judgment. We say, oh, well, that happened. Okay, that must have been blah. So when you're 8 years old and you're having a summer, everything's new. There's all these new experiences. You're writing it all down. As an adult, it's pretty much the same as others. So you sort of have already gotten good at the pattern matching. And so you're writing down very little. And so when you say, what happened this summer, it's hard to draw any footage up. And so then you say, my God, it just disappeared. So that's the general story. So
I guess what that means is that you should just try to seek out novel experiences, and then maybe time won't seem like it's going by so quickly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Within the constraints of good decision-making, as you would point out, yes.
So if you had to think about like a decision-making tool or idea or strategy that would be like the most powerful generally for people and also sort of for the next generation, what's the strategy right now that you might be obsessed with?
The one that I'm obsessed with is the Ulysses contract. And this is the idea of making a contract with your future self who you know is going to behave badly when they're faced with some temptation. So, for example, Ulysses, the Greek hero, is coming home from the Trojan War. He knows he's going to pass the island of the Sirens. They sing so beautifully, he can't wait to hear that, but he knows that like any mortal man, he'll go towards the island and crash into the rocks and die. So you remember what he does? He lashes himself to the mast. He has his men fill their ears with beeswax. And that way he's able to hear the siren song and they're able to sail past the island. What's going on there is the Ulysses distant from the island, the Ulysses of present mind, is contracting the future Ulysses, who he knows is going to behave badly, so that he's sure he will do the right thing. And I find this actually the most powerful tool. And so I am writing one of my next books about this because I just find it so powerful. So there are a million ways that people can set up Ulysses contracts. For example, when people go to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, the first thing they're told is clear all the alcohol out of your house, because you might decide, hey, I'm not going to drink anymore. I'm making this decision. But, on a festive Saturday night or a lonely Sunday night, you might, if it's there, you're going to give into that temptation. Or with drug addiction programs, they say, don't ever carry more than $20 of cash in your pocket, because you might think, I'm definitely not going to do any more drugs. But then you run into someone who says, hey, I've got some drugs to sell you. And if you've got the cash in your pocket, it'll burn a hole there. So there are many, many ways that we can do this in our lives. Going back to the chocolate chip cookie example, I just make sure we never have chocolate chip cookies or that kind of stuff sitting around the house. So anyway, that's a way that we can use our long-term decision-making when we have a sense of the kind of person we would like to be, to constrain our behavior when we know we're going to act badly.
So we've talked about this before. I'm a huge proponent of Ulysses contracts. Just, the sort of broad term for them is pre-commitment contracts, where you're pre-committing to some action that you want to take in the future. Different ways that you can do that if you really want to be going to the gym and that when you actually have to go, you're going to be like, oh, I'm too busy. There's ways to implement a pre-commitment contract. A simple way of doing a Ulysses contract would be, I could say to you, let's meet at the gym, because then I'm kind of screwing you over if I don't actually show up, right? So that's a way for me to contract my future self to actually follow through. And going back to this idea of a team of rivals, how do you think about the interaction between Ulysses contracts and the team of rivals? Like as I hear you talk about it, it sounds like what it's doing is throwing the balance for who's gonna kind of win that argument, or what the different weighting of the different rivalries is going to be, in a way that's going to help you to get to the things that you want in the long run. Is that kind of how you think about it?
That's exactly right. Your long-term decision-making says, look, I know I don't want to drink that alcohol or eat that cake or whatever the thing is. And so the thing that requires the self-understanding is knowing that no matter how strongly you want that to be true, that this other parliamentary party in your brain is going to make the wrong choice when faced with the temptation. And so it's actually setting up the situation so it can't do the wrong thing. Yeah. This is to my mind, one of the major lessons for, let's say, children or adults or anybody is really understanding who you're going to be in a particular situation, because generally we all have the misperception of, look, I know who I am. I know that if I'm making this decision that I'm not going to eat that chocolate cake tonight, I won't do it because I'm that kind of strong person. And it's an illusion to think we know ourselves in one moment who are going to be in the future. And so the way you have to do it is actually figure out a way to lash yourself to the mast.
Does it actually improve your decision-making just to make a commitment to somebody? For me to say to you, I don't want to eat chocolate chip cookies anymore. And even if I have them in my house, has sort of committing, and creating that accountability with another person, is that also helpful, or do you need to go to the extreme?
I think it's very helpful, but it needs to actually be a contract and not just a promise. So just here's an example. There was a woman who was very active in civil rights from the 1960s onward. She marched, she did all kinds of things. But she had a problem, which is that she always smoked and couldn't stop smoking and really wanted to quit. And so what she finally did is she told her friend, she wrote a $10,000 check and said to her friend, if you catch me smoking, I want you to donate this check to the Ku Klux Klan, which was her worst, the thing she hated the most in the world. And this is what's known as an anti-charity move. And the idea with this is that really makes her accountable, because that would be the worst thing in the world for her to see her money go to the KKK. So getting social, pressure in there really matters. But with all these things, there's different levels of what's going to make a difference. I'll just give you another example. There are these fitness boot camps that you can sign up for where you run around with a bunch of people at 7 a.m, you do a bunch of push-ups and jumping jacks and so on. But the way to really, the way to do this right is there are these camps where if you don't show up, everybody jogs to your house and does jumping jacks on your front lawn and screams your name until you come out. So it's socially embarrassing. It's useful to leverage social embarrassment to get yourself to do things that you don't want to do. So obviously nobody even takes that risk. They just show up and tie their shoes and get out there, even though they don't want to at 7 a.m.
Oh, that's really interesting. So you're making a distinction, and I think this is really important for listeners, between a promise or even like a commitment and a contract.
Yeah, exactly. Think about it this way. Ulysses didn't tie himself to the mast and tell his men, hey, put this little loop here so I can pull this if I really need to, that I can get out. He didn't, he was actually lashed to the mast and could not get out. And fundamentally, that's what Ulysses' contract needs to be.
Yeah, I love that jumping jacks on the lawn. Because again, going back to the team of rivals, we have this social identity, like how are other people going to view us? And that's going to be really embarrassing. And going back to the KKK, it's the same thing. It's recruiting. Well, I like to smoke and I like the feeling of smoking. I know what my future self wants, which is not to get lung cancer. So I'd like to stop smoking. Man, if I donated to the KKK, that would be so inconsistent with, what my identity is. So it sounds like the best contracts are not just going to resolve some of the rivalry between present and future, right? So they're not just going to resolve some of that rivalry and sort of weight it toward being good, making sure your future self is behaving, or your present self as it becomes in the future is behaving toward what your goals are. Not just that, but recruiting the different types of rivalries to align now on the right type of decision. One of them is, what is my social capital?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And by the way, when people are trying to lose weight, when they're on a long-term diet, social media is actually super helpful, because they end up posting and say, hey, I'm down 3 more pounds this month and so on. And everyone pipes in and says, hey, congratulations and so on. So now you don't want to give up your diet because you got all these people who are giving you thumbs up and so on. That stuff really works. It matters.
Yeah, that's a great example of social media used for good, for a good Ulysses contract. I love that. What do you think the impact on society will be when the Alliance succeeds in its mission to ensure decision education as part of every K through 12 students' learning experience?
I mean, I think it'll improve everybody's behavior, not in terms of people not doing crazy fun stuff, but in terms of just having a better sense of, is doing the short-term thing worth it right now? Just being able to understand, okay, I'm a different person in the short term than I am in the long term. What do I want long term? Just, one example, since we just mentioned social media a moment ago, is, kids have to deal with something that you and I never had to deal with, which is stuff they post now is going to be with them their entire life. And when they're running for president of the United States, their dumb tweet is going to be front and center. So just being more aware of thinking through time, I think, is one of the advantages. And hopefully being able to understand themselves as a complicated, multifaceted creature through time.
Thank you for that answer. If listeners want to go online and learn more about your work or follow you on social media, where would you send them to start?
Eagleman.com is my website, and I'm on all the social media channels. And my podcast is Inner Cosmos, which I'm happy to say has a high watermark of the #1 science podcast in the nation. So I'm thrilled to get to unpack meaty issues every week on that.
That's amazing. I highly recommend that podcast as a listen. Also, for any books or articles that we mentioned today, you can check the show notes out on the Alliance site. And David, this has been so fun. I really could have spoken to you for hours and hours. This was a blast for me. I hope it was fun for you as well. And thank you so much for joining us and for all your support of the work that we do at the Alliance.
You bet. Keep it up, Annie. Onward and upward.
Here at the Alliance for Decision Education, our mission is to improve lives by empowering students with essential skills and dispositions for making better decisions. We're spearheading a national movement to ensure that decision education is part of every student's learning experience. Through this podcast and other initiatives, we're raising awareness about decision education, and we'd appreciate your support. Visit our website at alliancefordecisioneducation.org and follow us on your favorite social media platform. If you have any suggestions for future interviews or episode topics, please email us at connect@alliancefordecisioneducation.org. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with others and leave a rating and review. And make sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platform so you don't miss any episodes. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us again soon.